welcome to my channel. In this video I want to give you some insights on how to paint and create the models for my nightly themed Space Marine chapter, so let's get started. It all begins with a fitting body part, and for this fella I use the Black Templar's Emperor's Champions kit. I put together the body, cut off the arms, and also removed some plastic from his leg to give him a different pose. In most cases I try to aim for a more stoic and subtle appeal on the minis for this army, so I tried to tone down the action level on this one a little bit too. Anyways, for the next step I took a Deathwing mace and an Inner Circle companion's arm and combined them. I then attached the arm to the mini, while also adding the lower part of the Stormcast weapon as the lower part of the new mace. To emphasize the overall knightly vibe on this mini, I wanted to add a shield on the left arm. I therefore took a look into my bits box and grabbed this Dominion Stormcast shield. I then got rid of the bearded guy on the front by cutting off the more prominent parts before I started scrubbing all over the shield with my hobby knife. When cleaning up bits with this scrubbing technique, I then like to use this plastic cement to get rid of any remaining little fluffs on the surface. I just put on a thin coat, and after letting it set for a while, I glued it to the mini. And with the pose of the mini being in place for the most part, it was time to add the helmet. In case you're following me on Instagram, I guess you already know which type of helmet I'm going for. So I grabbed my bag with 3D printed salads and attached one to the mini. After finding the right pose for the head, I then glued on the backpack. And also added one of these tiny shield pieces. I then thought about adding a bit more overall dynamic to the mini. To achieve this, I grabbed one of these longer purity seals, attached it right beneath the small shield in the wind direction that is already implied by the waving tunic. To push this effect even farther, I then took a bigger Skaven scroll piece and attached it to the back of the mini. After that, I also wanted to add a little handle to the shield. For this I took these mini chains, placed them around the arms, and then dribbled some super glue right over it. And after adding a second chain, it was time for some milliput to fill in the leftover gaps. For this I took a piece of milliput and one of these silicone modeling tools to smooth it out. When filling gaps with milliput, I then like to use an old brush with some water to smooth it even further, while also removing the excess material. After that I repeated the process for every gap that remained and also re-established a bit of the arm brace with some green stuff. And now it was time to start the painting process. I therefore used some black paint as a base coat and took my hobby knife to add. Turns out I messed up the footage, so I decided to paint another piece for the armor part. Back to the video. Back in black, I then took my hobby knife to add some scratches here and there. I prefer to do this step after applying the first layer of paint, as it provides better visual feedback on the process and also makes it easier to create ultra thin scratches in the paint layer itself. Though, in case you don't want little plastic fluffs in your paint job, it's necessary to go over the armor with a dry brush afterwards. I then repainted it black, and for the metallics, I then used an old brush where I bent the bristles before to create some additional random scratches while applying the paint. I then took some thinned metallic paint, wiped some off on a towel, and then did a semi-dry brush on the whole armor, making sure to hit it from different angles to create more impurities on the run. I now did this to a point where most of the armor was covered. And now it is time for my secret weapon for quick dirt and weathering effects, namely liquid pigments. It's so great, even the bottle has some dirt effect on it. Like most of my paints do actually. Okay, this stuff already has a wash-like consistency, so I just mixed black soot with burnt earth and applied it over the whole armor. I then tried to work with the paint while it's still wet, so after applying it I come back with the wet brush and removed some from the surface. My approach here is to free the raised areas, like the upper part of the chest plate, while pushing the wash into the lower parts to create stronger contrast. And after letting it set, I guess we are already at a point where the armor could be called battle ready. But to push the effect a bit further, I did some back and forth with the two steps of adding some metallics to certain areas and dulling it down with the wash. Playing a bit around to see which areas work well as the brighter parts and also trying to flesh out the edges. I actually prefer using a brush with natural bristles for the step, as the resulting scratches tend to be somewhat smoother. If you are doing this, just make sure it's a brush you wouldn't use again otherwise, for obvious reasons. And after some repetition, I just finished it up by adding some little scratches with a good brush this time. So this was a very quick take on how I paint Grimdark metallic armor. I plan to do a more in-depth guide for several methods in the future, but for now, let's get back to our little space soldier. I applied the same method for the remaining metal parts, while adding some old copper to it and highlighting it with the previous paint. And with that, the metallics on the model were done so far. I then took some Vallejo basic skin tone and mixed it with a bit of leather brown to paint the fabric. I applied thin coats of this mix till I had a nice coverage. Using the basic skin tone to add a first layer of highlights on the outstanding areas. And after that, I again applied the liquid pigment mix. Like before, I revisited the still wet paint with a wet brush and moved it around. I then applied a second coat of the wash to tone down the upper part of the tunic even more. The fabric is therefore a good example for my overall approach when painting minis. While I like to aim for a somewhat realistic style that tries to encapsulate the grim vibe of the setting, I also try to maintain elements of a 2D painting approach. By that I mean that I still try to establish highlights with brighter colors on certain elements in addition of creating texture and weathering. While this does not necessarily add to the overall realism of the paint job, it still makes it somewhat more visually pleasing to me. Anyways, for the belt I just used Vallejo's level brown mixed with a tiny bit of flat earth and black. I then added some highlights and scratches with the level brown and finish it with a dark wash, which for me here is basically just heavy diluted black paint. Now it was time for the shield. Here I started again with the initial thin coats of Vallejo basic skin tone, and after covering the whole area I then started to paint the heraldry, starting by using some Caliban green to roughly paint across on the surface. I then filled out two areas to get this somewhat enormous check pattern, and to add a bit of variety and also save some decals, I also painted two stripes on the lower part. I then applied some fitting decals, like this chapter symbol which I printed on some decal paper, and some of the common Space Marine stuff. With that step finished, it was now time for some sponging. So I stripped off a small piece of a kitchen sponge and made it more uneven by removing some extra parts. I then took a tweezer and dabbed the sponge into some watered down basic skin tone to dab on some battle damage on that shield. Skilled as I am, I did a little smear instead of the dab, so I tried to fix the mistake by using some more Caliban green. I then added some scratches here and there and then used the sponge again. This time with diluted black paint to add some damage to the brighter parts of the shield. After that I applied the pigment wash with the most part black suit and used a wet brush to free the middle of the surface. Finally, I just added a bit metallic paint on the edges to finish it up. For the next step I wanted to add some light effects on the mini, starting with the mace. For that I used a mix of scarlet red and yellow flame from the two thin coats line. I watered it down heavily and then applied it over the top of the mace, letting it flow in the recesses. I then built up the effect by adding more thin coats with more and more yellow in the mix. After that I give it a little dry brush with some of the metallic paint. And again toning it down with the liquid pigment wash. I also built out the same effect for the part underneath, adding several thin layers of orange while mixing it brighter with every coat. I tried to achieve better coverage in the areas where the heat is generated. To do this I applied more layers of paint in these spots, while using fewer towards the lower areas. In the end I wanted to add a little smoke and fire effect on the backpack. I therefore used some Halloween spiderweb and tried to tear off a smoke-shaped like piece. So far this material is a real pain to work with. but I'm also quite happy with the results, so I worked my way through. Finally pulling off a smoke-shaped piece and added a little bit of PVA glue to it. I then attached the piece to the Mini and took a scissor to cut it in shape. And to add some color, I now took the Mini to my super professional airbrush station. I started to gently spray black on the cotton, and after that I tried to build a fire effect by adding several thin coats from red to yellow. Starting with the widespread red, I then added more yellow to the mix after each coat. With each layer I also reduced the area that gets sprayed, so that the center of the flame is the brightest spot. Back at my desk I then started to add some bright yellow to the area where the glue was placed. Glued cotton naturally creates a texture that kinda looks like flame in my opinion, so I basically just paint the already existing edges. I then added some wash-like diluted black paint to the sphere, followed by a layer of yellow. And with the backpack successfully burning, I just finished it up by painting the edges with some metallics. So now the only remaining thing was to find a fitting base for the Mini. The base consists of some cork, a cut-off brush protection thing and some rune-like brickwork which is cast off from a Stormcast basing bit with blue stuff and milliput. I then added some of this Vallejo diorama FX stuff and scattered some stones over it. Fixing the stones with some scenic glue, which is basically just another term for PVA glue with water and a drop of dish soap to break the surface tension. With the glue set, I gave the base a dark brown base coat off camera. And after some dry brushing with different shades of brown, I then attached the Mini to it. I needed to add a few additional rocks to give it a good stand though, but after painting these up in the same manner, it was time for some finishing touches with bright pigment. With a mix of dark and semi-dark earth colors, I tried to give the base a convincing wasteland look. While also adding some on the boots and the purity seals of the marine to blend everything together. And after that, it was now time for some rimming. You know what I mean. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss out on future content. Until then, take care.